The sun hung heavy over the cracked pavement of a quiet Nevada suburb, its heat radiating off the asphalt in shimmering waves. Daniel Pierce stood on his weathered front porch, the paint peeling at the edges like an old scab. In his left hand, he clutched a sleek black medical case, the kind with a digital lock and a bright orange label that blazed with the words, "Insulin Emergency Use Only." His right hand hovered over the doorknob, fingers twitching with a mix of exhaustion and dread. Inside, his daughter, Sophie, lay sprawled across the couch, her breath shallow, her skin glistening with a sickly sheen of sweat. Type 1 diabetes didn't wait for anyone, not for permission, not for HOA meetings, not for the petty bureaucracy that had begun to strangle this neighborhood like a noose. Before Daniel could turn the knob, a shadow sliced through the sunlight. Marjorie Teller emerged from the neatly trimmed oleanders that lined the walkway, her silhouette sharp and unyielding. She was the HOA president, a title she wore like a crown forged from iron and spite. Her gray blazer was pristine despite the heat, her hair pulled into a tight bun that seemed to defy GRA-VY tie. She carried a clipboard, her weapon of choice, and her lips curled into a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "That's not an approved delivery," she said, her voice clipped and cold, as if she were reading from a script etched into her soul. Her eyes flicked to the case, narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's insulin. For my daughter. She's crashing right now. I need to get this inside." His tone was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, a fault line ready to rupture. Marjorie didn't budge. "Rules are rules, Mr. Pierce. All medical packages must be pre-registered with the board. You know that. We sent out the memo last spring." She tapped her clipboard with a manicured nail, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. "Pre-registered?" Daniel's voice rose, incredulous. "This isn't a goddamn Amazon package. She'll die without it. Move." He took a step forward, but Marjorie sidestepped with the agility of a predator, planting herself between him and the door. "Then you should have paid your fence maintenance fee on time," she said, her tone dripping with venom masked as righteousness. "Actions have consequences." Before Daniel could react, she snatched the case from his grip with a speed that belied her stiff posture. The orange label glared up at her, unmistakable, but she didn't flinch. She turned on her heel, her loafers clicking against the concrete as she marched toward the HOA officia squat, stucco building at the end of the cul-de-sac, its windows tinted black like the eyes of a shark. "Give it back," Daniel roared, lunging after her. His voice cracked, raw with desperation. "That's my daughter's life you're holding." But Marjorie didn't stop. She reached the office, punched a code into the keypad, and slipped inside. The door slammed shut with a metallic clang, locking behind her. Daniel's world tilted. He could hear Sophie's faint gasps through the open window, each one weaker than the last. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else. "My daughter's diabetic. Someone stole her insulin. She's going into shock. Please send help. Now." His voice broke on the last word, a plea to the universe as much as to the dispatcher. Inside, Sophie was a crumpled heap on the Lee VY room floor by the time he stumbled back through the door. Her chestnut hair clung to her forehead, damp with sweat. Her lips were tinged blue, her chest barely rising. Daniel dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uselessly over her frail form. "Stay with me, Soph. Help's coming. Just hold on." His words were a lifeline, thrown into a sea he couldn't navigate. Across the street, Marjorie stood behind the tinted glass of the HOA office, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a queen surveying her kingdom. She knew what was in that case. She'd seen the label, read the warning. And yet, there she stood, unmoved, the insulin locked in a filing cabinet behind her petty trophy in her war against the Pierces. The ambulance screeched into the cul-de-sac 8 minutes later, an eternity compressed into a nightmare. Daniel was on the porch again, while VYing frantically, his shirt soaked with sweat and panic. The paramedics didn't waste time on questions. One look at Sophie, her limp body, Her ashen skin, the faint twitch of her fingers told them everything. A burly medic named Torres knelt beside her, his gloved hands moving with practiced speed. He pricked her finger, the glucometer shrieking a warning. Blood sugar, 32 milligrams per deciliter. Critical. Lethal. Where's the insulin? Torres barked, his voice cutting through the haze. Daniel pointed a trembling finger across the street. There. In that office. She took it, locked it up. Hua bun seat. Torres didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the building, his boots pounding the pavement. Marjorie appeared at the door, her clipboard still in hand, her expression a mask of defiance. This is private property, she said, her voice icy. You can't just. Open the door, Torres snapped, towering over her. Now, or I'll break it down. It's against protocol. Torres didn't wait for her to finish. He drove his shoulder into the door, the frame splintering under his weight. The lock gave way with a groan, and he shoved past Marjorie, who stumbled back, clutching her pearls as if they could shield her. Inside, he spotted the filing cabinet locked, of course. He didn't bother with keys. One swift kick, and the drawer crumpled open. The black case sat there, untouched, the orange label mocking the absurdity of it all. Torres grabbed it, ripped it open, and pulled out the vial of insulin, already racing back to Sophie. Daniel watched, his breath caught in his throat, as Torres injected the insulin into Sophie's arm. Another medic hooked up in 4, saline dripping in her veins like a lifeline. Her body was still, too still, her chest barely moving. Come on, Soph, Daniel whispered, his voice a prayer he didn't know he could still make. The monitor beeped erratically, then flatlined. She's crashing, Torres shouted. The second medic started compressions, counting aloud. 1, 2, 3, a defibrillator hummed to life. Clear. The jolt made Sophie's body arch off the floor, but the monitor stayed silent. Daniel pressed himself against the wall, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles bled. Another shock. Another eternity. Thena, faint beep. Then another. Weak, irregular, but there. Sophie's heart was back, clinging to life by a thread. The paramedics didn't pause. They loaded her onto a stretcher, rushing her to the ambulance. Daniel climbed in after them, the doors slamming shut as the sirens wailed into the distance. Sophie's pulse had stopped for 57 seconds that carved themselves into Daniel's soul like a brand. The ICU was a sterile prison of beeping machines and fluorescent light. Sophie lay in the bed, a tangle of tubes and wires, her face pale as the sheets beneath her. A ventilator hissed rhythmically, forcing air into her lungs. The doctors had induced a coma to protect her brain. They said too much trauma, too little oxygen, too close a call. Daniel sat beside her, his broad shoulders hunched, his hands rough from years of construction work, now resting uselessly on his knees. His wife, Elena, clung to his arm, her dark eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived, her grief a silent storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Daniel hadn't slept in 4 days. Coffee was a bitter memory, its effects long faded. His phone buzzed incessantly, texts from neighbors, calls from reporters, voicemails he didn't have the strength to answer. He ignored them all. Instead, he pulled his laptop from a battered duffel bag and set it on the bedside table, the glow of the screen casting shadows across Sophie's still face. He wasn't just a father now. He was a man who'd spent 15 years as a state investigator, digging through corruption and unraveling lies. And he knew what this was. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, but a deliberate act of malice. He started typing. Not a complaint, not a plea, but a criminal accusation. He didn't care about HOA arbitration or CIVY. Suits, those were games for people who thought justice wore a suit and tie. This was personal. This was war. Charge. Attempted manslaughter with intent to harm. He had plenty of it. The Ring camera footage showed Marjorie snatching the case, her lips moving as she read the label aloud. Insulin emergency, use only. His phone had recorded her words. You should have paid your fence maintenance fee on time. The paramedics' body cams captured her standing there, refusing to move, as Sophie's life slipped away. And the medical reports gold. Clinical proof of 57 seconds of cardiac arrest sealed the case like a tombstone. He worked through the night, each keystroke a hammer strike. Elena watched him in silence, her hand resting on his shoulder, a quiet anchor in the chaos. By dawn, the document was finished. 27 pages of fury distilled into legal precision. He emailed it to the district attorney's office at 5:13 a.m. The subject line ablaze: felony submission, attempted manslaughter 12-year-old victim. He closed the laptop, leaned over, and pressed his lips to Sophie's forehead. "I couldn't stop her in time, kiddo," he whispered, his voice rough with unshed tears. "But I'll make damn sure she pays." Marjorie Teller didn't see it coming. When a sheriff's deputy knocked on her door 2 days later, she assumed it was another complaint about her prized rose bushes encroaching on the sidewalk. She opened the door in a silk robe, her hair still in rollers, a cup of chamomile tea steaming in her hand. The deputy handed her a thick envelope, his face impassive. "You've been served," he said, turning away before she could protest. She tore it open, expecting a nuisance lawsuit, something she could countersue and bury in legal fees. Instead, she found an arrest warrant. Criminal charges, attempted manslaughter, obstruction of emergency medical treatment. Her tea slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there as the words sank in. This wasn't a fine. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. This was prison. The arrest came during the next HOA meeting, a calculated spectacle. The clubhouse was packed, residents whispering about the Insulin incident, board members fidgeting with their agendas. Marjorie sat at the head of the table, her composure a brittle shell. She was mid-sentence, lecturing about mailbox uniformity, when the double doors swung open. 2 deputies marched in, their boots thudding against the linoleum. "Marjorie Teller," the lead deputy said, his voice a guillotine. "You're under arrest." The room erupted in gasps. Marjorie stood, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "This is outrageous. I'm in a private meeting." "You have the right to remain silent," the deputy continued, stepping behind her. The cuffs clicked around her wrists, cold and final. She sputtered, her face flushing red, but the deputies didn't pause. They escorted her out, past the wide-eyed board members, past the neighbors who'd once bowed to her every whim. Outside, a news van waited, its camera rolling as she stumbled into the sunlight, her robe replaced by a rumpled blazer, her dignity stripped bare. The reporter pounced. "MS. Teller, do you have a statement on the charges?" Marjorie's mouth opened, but no words came. The camera caught it all, the shock, the fear, the unraveling of a woman who'd thought herself untouchable. Sophie lingered in the coma for 9 days, each one a battleground of hope and despair. The machines kept her alive, their hum a constant reminder of how close she'd come to slipping away. Daniel and Elena took shifts, one always at her side, the other pacing the halls or grabbing coffee that tasted like ash. Elena kept a journal, scribbling every flicker of progress, Sophie's toes curling, her eyelids twitching, a spike in her oxygen levels. Daniel didn't write. He sat, he watched, he waited. His anger simmered, a slow burn that kept him upright when exhaustion threatened to pull him under. On the 10th morning, as the sun crept through the blinds, Sophie stirred. It wasn't dramatic, no Hollywood gasp, no sudden awakening. Just a small shift, her fingers curling against the blanket, her head tilting toward the sound of Daniel's voice as he read her a chapter from The Hobbit. "Soph," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You in there?" Her eyes opened hazel, hazy but alive. They found his face, lingered, and a faint smile tugged at her cracked lips. "Dad?" she croaked, her voice a thread pulled from a tapestry of silence. Did you fix it?" Daniel's chest caved in, relief and guilt crashing together. He sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face as he gripped her hand. "Yes, sweetheart. I fixed it. You're safe now." Elena rushed in, alerted by the nurses, and the room filled with quiet sobs and the steady beep of the monitor proof that Sophie had clawed her way back. Recovery was slow. Sophie's muscles were weak, her coordination shaky, but her spirit burned bright. The doctors marveled at her resilience, tossing around terms like miraculous and fighter. Daniel didn't care about their words. He cared about the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, the way she squeezed his hand when he helped her sit up. She was alive. That was enough. Marjorie's trial was a circus, the courtroom packed with reporters, neighbors, and strangers who'd seen the story on the nightly news. She sat at the defense table, her hair dull, her blazer ill-fitting, her hands trembling as she adjusted her glasses. Her lawyer, a slick man named Hargrove, argued that she'd acted within HOA guidelines, that the Insulin case was unmarked and posed a potential threat. It was a flimsy lie, and the prosecution dismantled it with surgical precision. They played the ring footage. Marjorie picking up the case, reading the label aloud, insulin emergency use only, then smirking as she walked away. They played Daniel's 911 call, his voice breaking as he begged for help. They showed photos of Sophie in the ER, her body a battlefield of tubes and bruises. And then they dropped the bombshell, an email chain from the HOA's private server, uncovered after a subpoena pierced their digital fortress. The emails stretched back months, a festering thread titled Pierce Family Violations. One from board member Carl Hensley read, "They keep dodging fines time to hit them where it hurts." Another from Marjorie, "If they won't comply, maybe losing something precious will wake them up." The intent was clear, damning, and undeniable. The gallery buzzed, jurors shifted in their seats, and Marjorie's face went white as the emails were read aloud. Judge Evelyn Carter presided, her presence a storm cloud over the proceedings. When it was her turn to speak, her voice was steel-wrapped in velvet. "This is not about rules," she said, her gaze locked on Marjorie. "This is about power. You saw that label. You knew what it meant. And you chose to take it not out of ignorance, but out of spite. You nearly killed a child over a fence fee." She paused, letting the weight settle. "No HOA charter gives you the right to play God." The verdict came swiftly. Guilty on all counts: attempted manslaughter, obstruction, and conspiracy. Sentencing was set for a month later, but bail was denied. Marjorie was led away in cuffs, her head bowed, the clink of metal echoing through the silent courtroom. Daniel and Elena sat in the gallery, hands clasped, their faces unreadable. This wasn't VY Tory. It was reckoning. The fallout was seismic. The HOA board dissolved overnight, its remaining members indicted as co-conspirators. The neighborhood turned feral protesters picketed the clubhouse, spray painting justice for Sophie across its walls. National headlines screamed, "HOA tyranny nearly kills girl criminal charges stick." Property values tanked, but no one cared. The story had transcended the cul-de-sac, igniting debates about power, PRI-VY leg, and the petty tyrants who hid behind rulebooks. 8 months later, Sophie stood on a soccer field, her cleats sinking into the grass. She was thinner, her gait uneven, but her eyes sparkled with defiance. A new insulin pump hummed beneath her jersey, a quiet guardian. She took a penalty kick, the ball sailing past the goalie's outstretched hands. The crowd, parents, teammates, strangers who'd followed her story erupted. Daniel stood in the bleachers, Elena beside him, their hands intertwined. He didn't cheer. He just watched, his throat tight, his heart full. That same week, Nevada's governor signed the Sophie Pierce Emergency Access Act into law. One line, unassailable. No homeowners association may obstruct access to Life SA VYing medical treatment, under penalty of criminal prosecution. Daniel had testified at the State House, his voice steady as he recounted the 57 seconds Sophie's heart had stopped. The room had wept, and the bill passed unanimously. After the game, a reporter cornered him, mic in hand. "Mr. Pierce, what does this mean to you?" she asked. He looked at Sophie, laughing with her teammates, then back at the camera. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about her. And every kid like her. I didn't want revenge. I wanted them safe. His voice was quiet, firm, final. Marjorie Teller was sentenced to 12 years. Her co-conspirators to lesser terms. The HOA was disbanded, its assets liquidated to fund Sophie's medical bills. Of bitter irony, she'd never save her. But for Daniel, justice wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the sound of Sophie's laugh, the thud of her foot against the soccer ball, the steady hum of her pump. Sometimes, justice didn't roar. Sometimes it ran, free and alive, across a field bathed in sunlight. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.